Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Chapter 19, The Surprise of the Chemin de Dames. At the end of April, when the battle in the north died down, Ludendorff, finding too many troops in front of him, looked elsewhere. The most favorable operation in itself, he writes, footnote, in My War Memories, page 615, end of footnote, was to continue the attack on the English army at Ypres and Bayeux. Before we could attack here again, the enemy must become weaker and our communications must be improved. He had thus resigned all the decisive strategic objects for which the German armies had been fighting since March 21. He had first abandoned the great roll-up of the British line from Arras northwards and the general destruction of the British armies, in favor of the more definite but still vital aim of taking Amiens and dividing the British from the French armies. Arrested in this, he had struck in the north to draw British reserves from the Amiens battlefield. But the Battle of the Luce, begun as a diversion, had offered the lesser yet still enormous prize of the northern Channel ports. Now he must abandon that, and his strategic ambition, already thrice contracted, must henceforward sink to an altogether lower plane. The Fourth German Offensive Battle of 1918 was to a large extent a mere bid for a local victory, and apart from its usefulness in diverting Allied troops from the fateful fronts, offered no direct deadly strategic possibilities. Marshal Foch saw with unerring eye the grand and simple proportion of events. Not deceived by the vast mass of frightfully important but irrelevant considerations which obscured the primary issues, he ranged the strategic necessities of the Allied armies in their true order. Of these, the first beyond compare was the union of the French and British armies, second, the preservation of the Channel ports, and third, though in a less decisive sphere, the defense of Paris. Pétain, on the other hand, showed on more than one occasion that his valuations were different. His attitude on the night of March 24, which precipitated the Doullens Conference, proves that he would have rated the loss of Paris as a greater misfortune than the severing of the connection between the French and British armies. We shall see later a still more glaring example of this error, which in so accomplished a soldier can only be attributed to the intrusion of sentiment. Paris could have been occupied by the Germans in June 1918, without preventing the collapse of the Central Empires in November. But the loss of the Channel ports and the consequent halving of the British military effort would have meant another year of war, and the severance of the British and French armies might easily have led to their total and final defeat. Mercifully, the good sense of Foch pierced through the fog of false appearances. From the moment when he obtained the supreme command, he steadily massed the reserves, in full harmony with the British view, to safeguard the junction of the British and French armies. And behind him, with equal comprehension, Clemenceau, when the need came, declared, "I shall fight in front of Paris. I shall fight in Paris. I shall fight behind Paris." Thus these great men were able to exalt their minds above the dearest temptations of their hearts, and thus we found the path to safety by discerning the beacons of truth. It followed from Foch's decision to gather the reserves in Flanders and between Compiègne and Amiens that dangerous denudations must be accepted on other important parts of the front. The movement northwards of so many French divisions was viewed with deep anxiety by Pétain and the French army headquarters. Pétain, indeed, made a strenuous effort to retain the last installment. But Foch insisted. Thus Ludendorff found, when the Battle of the Luce ended in deadlock, that it was not open to him to renew the Battle of Amiens. He was already committed to 2 great bulges, which he had conquered at the cost of heavy drafts upon the superior reserves he had gathered for the campaign. In neither could he advance in face of the strength against him, and from both he was unwilling to retire lest he should shatter the glittering but, as he knew well, already brittle confidence of Germany. Each of these bulges had its special disadvantages for the German troops. In the Somme region they were condemned to dwell amid their own devastations, and with communications which, although improved, made the mounting of a first-class offensive impossible. In the Bayeux salient the conditions were far worse. The scale was smaller, but, for this very reason, the discomfort was more intense. The whole of the conquered ground was commanded by the encircling British artillery, and this artillery, fed with unlimited ammunition and fresh guns, raked and swept the German salient night and day from 3/4 of the compass. In this cauldron nearly 20 German divisions must be constantly maintained at a cost which melted the reserves apace. It must have been with darkening misgivings that Ludendorff selected the point of his next attack. Outwardly all seemed to be going well. Actually all had miscarried. But the consolation of spectacular vengeance yet remained. Immense resources were still in hand. A dazzling victory could yet be won which, though barren in consequences, would still preserve the illusion of increasing success. As early as April 17, the Crown Prince's army group was ordered urgently to prepare an offensive on the Chemin des Dames, with the object of breaking through between Soissons and Rheims. The arrangements were made with the customary thoroughness and science and with unexampled secrecy. The 7th and 1st German armies assembled 29 divisions for the battle. No less than 1,158 batteries were deployed, and the moment was fixed for 2 a.m. on May 27. Foch knew as well as Pétain the forfeits to which his wise dispositions exposed the French armies, and both generals were during the whole of May unable to divine where the blow would fall. Blame has been attributed to the staff of the French Sixth Army. The choleric temperament of its commander, General Duchesne, had discouraged and estranged his subordinates, and the machine worked with friction. Footnote: by Pierre Feu, GQG, Section 1, Volume 2, page 178. End of footnote. At this time, above all others, efforts should have been made, without regard to losses, to pierce the enemy's screen by sudden raids, now here, now there, and gain the indispensable information. But nothing of this kind was done successfully either by the Sixth Army or elsewhere along the French front. 4 French divisions were in line on the Chemin des Dames, with 4 more in reserve behind the Aisne. On their right was the 9th British Army Corps under Sir Alexander Hamilton Gordon, comprising 3 divisions in the line, the 21st, 8th and 50th, also the 25th Division in reserve, all shockingly mutilated in the northern battle, and sent at Foch's earnest desire to what was stated by the French to be the quietest sector of the front in order to refit and train their recruits. In reply to formal warnings from the British General Headquarters that an attack had been mounted against the Aisne front, the French Sixth Army Staff stated on the morning of May 25, "In our opinion there are no indications that the enemy has made preparations that would enable him to attack tomorrow." What followed is exciting. At daybreak on the 26th, 2 German prisoners were taken by the French. One was a private and the other an officer aspirant, belonging to different regiments of Jäger. On the way to divisional headquarters, their captors entered into conversation with them. The private said there was going to be an attack. The officer contradicted him. Arrived at the Army Corps Intelligence Center, the prisoners were examined separately. The officer, questioned first, was voluble, and declared that the Germans had no intention of making an offensive on this front. The interrogation of the private followed. He said that the soldier believed that they would attack that night or the following night. He was not sure of the date. Pressed, he said that cartridges and grenades had already been distributed, but not the field rations. He had seen the previous day near his billets soldiers belonging to Guards regiments. He knew no more. The officer was then recalled. He was told that the laws of war had in no way forced him to speak, but that he had volunteered statements for which he would be held responsible. To give false information was the act of a spy. On this he became visibly perturbed, and under pressure gave in the end the most complete details of the attack which impended the next day. It was already 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 26th. The alarm was given, and the troops available took up their battle positions. Pierre Feu has described the terrible hours which Petain and the French headquarters staff now endured far away at Provins. Footnote: in GQG, Section 1, Volume 2, page 187. End of footnote. They knew that an immense disaster was certain. They knew that no reinforcements could reach the scene for several days, and thereafter for a still longer period only at the rate of 2 divisions a day. Meanwhile, there was nothing in human power that could be done. All through the night they sat in their silent offices, bowed under the blow about to fall and suffering another form of the tortures to which the troops were doomed. At 1 o'clock next morning the German barrage descended on a 30-kilometer front, and 3 hours later 18 divisions advanced upon the 4 French and 3 refitting British divisions. Although the troops on the ground were alert, the strategic surprise was complete and overwhelming. After 3.5 hours, artillery and trench mortar preparations, says the Crown Prince, footnote, in My War Experiences, page 318, end of footnote, the divisions surged forward against the Chemin de Dam. The small enemy force holding the position, 6 French and 3 English trench divisions, were overrun, and the Chemin de Dam and the Aisne-Marne Canal reached in one swoop. As early as the afternoon our leading units were over the Aisne. By the evening, the center of the Third Army had already reached the Vesley on both sides of Fismes. A breakthrough with a depth of 20 kilometers had been attained in one day. The Aisne-Marne Canal was also crossed by the left wing of the Seventh Army. A most stubborn defense was made by the 3 British divisions which were in the line, and by the 25th Division almost immediately involved. On their right stood the 45th French Algerian Division, which, not being itself attacked, gave energetic assistance. Hinging on this, the British line swung back under immense pressure on its front and with its left continually compromised. The retiring British found behind them, fortunately, the hilly and wooded country to the west of Rheims, which helped the defense in a receding battle. The 19th British Division had also luckily arrived at Chalons for rest and recuperation, and on the 4th day they sustained the British line. The 21st Division was by then practically destroyed, and by June 1 the whole 5 British divisions were hardly equal to the full strength of one. All the troops bore themselves as on the Luce a month earlier. Battalions were completely exterminated, and a large portion of the artillery perished with their guns upon the field. The French villagers, in their ignorance and terror, assailed the retreating troops with hostile demonstrations. Meanwhile, upon the British left, the German punch had smashed right through. General Duchesne's staff delayed too long the destruction of the bridges across the Aisne, and most of them fell intact into the hands of the invaders. By June 2, Soissons had fallen and the Germans had reached the Marne at Château-Thierry. Pierre Feu has described in a moving passage the next event. Now suddenly the roads between Provins and the front towards Meaux and towards Coulommiers began to be filled with endless streams of Americans. The impression made upon the hard-pressed French by this seemingly inexhaustible flood of gleaming youth in its first maturity of health and vigor was prodigious. None were under 20, and few were over 30. As crammed in their lorries, they clattered along the roads, singing the songs of a new world at the tops of their voices, burning to reach the bloody field. The French headquarters were thrilled with the impulse of new life. All felt, he says, that they were present at the magical operation of the transfusion of blood. Life arrived in floods to reanimate the mangled body of a France bled white by the innumerable wounds of 4 years. Indeed, the reflection conformed with singular exactness to the fact. Half-trained, half-organized, with only their courage, their numbers, and their magnificent youth behind their weapons, they were to buy their experience at a bitter price. But this they were quite ready to do. The misfortunes of the Battle of the Chemin des Dames had the remarkable effect of improving the relations between the British and French armies. After a surprise so glaring and a retreat of 20 kilometers in a single day, the record for all the battles on the Western Front, the French were in no position to maintain the airs of superiority which they had been unable to conceal from the Italians after Caporetto, or altogether from the British after the 21st of March. Up till the moment when they, in their turn, felt the force of a Ludendorff offensive, they had complacently assumed that the French army contained the only troops who could really hold a front under modern conditions. These illusions had been swept away by the German scythe. The intensity of their common tribulations united the Allies more closely than ever. Moreover, the French command were deeply grieved at the destructive losses suffered by the 5 British divisions committed to their care for a period of recuperation. They paid their tribute in generous and soldierly terms to the fighting achievements of these troops. The words of General Maistre, the commander of the group of armies concerned, may here be transcribed. With a doggedness, permit me to say thoroughly English, submerged by the hostile flood, you have reconstituted without failing new units to carry on the struggle which have at last enabled us to form the dike by which this deluge had been mastered. That achievement no Frenchman who was a witness will forget. Footnote. In Sir Douglas Haig's command, Volume 2. End of footnote. The 2nd Devons and the 5th Battery of the 45th British Field Artillery Brigade were awarded the Croix de Guerre in consequence of their having fought until only memory remained. The advance of the Germans to Château-Thierry, barely 100 kilometers from Paris, confronted me with problems almost as serious and quite as imminent as those which had glared at us during the Battle of the Luce. I was responsible, among other things, for the whole supply of aeroplanes and aviation material of all kinds. The Ministry of Munitions was a gigantic shop from which the Air Ministry ordered all they wanted. Under the incredible activities of Sir William Ware, then Secretary of State, the Air Force demands became staggering. We discovered that the French had a large surplus manufacturing capacity. I had therefore, in agreement with Loucheur, directed Sir Arthur Duckham to place enormous orders with them. The French factories on which we depended for an essential part of our program were mostly grouped around Paris. The danger to the capital required elaborate plans for moving these establishments southwards in case of need, and at the same time a very nice decision whether and when to put them into operation. If we moved without cause, we interrupted production. If we tarried too long, we should not be able to get our machinery away. Paris was calm and even pleasant in these days of uncertainty. The long-range German cannon, which threw its shells about every half an hour, had effectively cleared away nearly all those who were not too busy nor too poor. The city was empty and agreeable by day, while by night there was nearly always the diversion of an air raid. The spirit of Clemenceau reigned throughout the capital. We are now giving ground, but we shall never surrender. We shall be victorious if the public authorities are equal to their task. Ludendorff had now made a third bulge in the Allied front. In all three, the German troops were uncomfortable, their communications extremely inferior, and their general strategic position delicate. It seemed probable that they would try to bite off or beat in the French salient, which jutted out between Montdidier and Château-Thierry, as far as Noyon. The deep forest region about Villers-Cotterêts, and the fact that there was only a single line of railway for all the Germans in the Château-Thierry bulge, made an attack from an eastern direction unlikely. The front before Compiègne, from Montdidier to Noyon, was clearly the most interesting. Monsieur Clemenceau had authorized and even urged me to go everywhere, see everything, and tell Lloyd George what we are doing. Accordingly, as the work of the Inter-Allied Munitions Conference, which was then proceeding, permitted, I visited the armies of Generals Humbert and D'Aubigny, who awaited the expected shock. I knew both these generals personally, and was still better acquainted with General Fayolle, who commanded the army group. One could reach the front line from Paris in less than 3 hours, and I followed with the closest attention the improved methods of defense which the French were adopting. Nothing of consequence was now offered to the German opening bombardment. A strong picket line of detached machine-gun nests, carefully concealed, was alone in contact with the enemy. Behind these devoted troops, for whom an assault could only mean destruction, was a zone 3,000 or 4,000 yards deep, in which only strong points were held by comparatively small forces. It was not until at least 7,000 yards separated them from the hostile batteries that the real resistance of the French infantry and artillery was prepared. When one saw all the fortifications and devices, the masses of batteries and machine guns with which the main line of defense bristled, and knew that this could not be subjected to heavy bombardment until the stubborn pickets far in front had been exterminated, it seemed difficult to believe that any troops in the world could carry the whole position from front to rear in a single day. On the evening of June 8, I walked over the center of the French line in front of Compiègne. The presage of battle was in the air. All the warnings had been given, and everyone was at his post. The day had been quiet, and the sweetness of the summer evening was undisturbed even by a cannon shot. Very calm and gallant, and even gay, were the French soldiers who awaited the new stroke of fate. By the next evening, all the ground over which they had led me was in German hands, and most of those with whom I had talked were dead or prisoners. Early in the morning of the 9th, the 18th German Army began what they have called the Battle of Noyon, and at the same time the 7th German Army attacked southwest of Soissons. The whole of the threatened front was thus on fire. The severity of the onslaught lasted for 2 days only. The Germans penetrated to a depth of 15 kilometers and set their feet on the heights before Compiègne. But the methods of defense exacted a heavy toll, and a wise elasticity in the use of ground enabled the French to economize losses. From the 11th onwards, Fayolle began to launch carefully prepared counterattacks in great force, particularly in the direction of Méry. These continued throughout the 12th and 13th. But already on the 11th, Ludendorff had felt the task beyond his power. In consequence, he says, footnote, in my War Memories, page 634, end of footnote, of the great accumulation of enemy troops, General Headquarters directed the 18th Army to break off the attack on the 11th in order to avoid casualties. It was quite evident that the attack commenced in the meantime by the 7th Army southwest of Soissons would not get through. The action of the 18th Army had not altered the strategical situation, nor had it provided any fresh tactical data. So far, in all this year, the Allies had experienced nothing but recoil. The martial might of Germany lay heavy on all. The sense of grappling with a monster of seemingly unfathomable resources and tireless strength, invulnerable, since slaughter even on the greatest scale was no deterrent, could not be excluded from the mind. No one hoped for a swift result. But the idea that the war could reach any end other than the total defeat of Germany was strictly excluded even from private conversation. All the dominant personalities were resolved to fight on to victory, and the soldiers, with simple faith, took this for granted. Says Ludendorff, it was certainly discouraging that our two great attacks had not been forced a decision. Footnote. In my War Memories, page 642. End of footnote. It was certainly discouraging that our two great attacks had not forced a decision. That they had been victories was obvious. The evil effect of disillusionment was doubled by the fact that we could not overcome it in our then state of mind. But they were not victories. They were only placards. Of the 5 great battles which had been fought, the first 3 against the British had failed to achieve any one of the progressively diminishing strategic results at which they had aimed. The 4th against the French was a local victory, very spectacular, but without strategic consequence. And the last, the Battle of Noyon, was a very decided arrest. The supreme offensive was in slack water. The 11th of June on the French front had marked just such a milestone in the war as had the 12th of April with the British Army. On the German side, in spite of sensational triumphs, all was disillusionment. Behind the Allied front, with all their bitter experiences, the foundation of confidence was solid. These 3 months of ceaseless battle had indeed witnessed a profound alteration of the strategic balance. The main forces of Germany were now deeply committed. The sovereign element of surprise, without which no great offensive was possible, depended upon the power to have simultaneously in readiness on different parts of the front 4 or 5 attacks of the first magnitude. This had been the baffling factor to the Allies before the 21st of March. But most of these had now already been let off. The remaining possibilities open to Ludendorff were restricted and to a large extent defined. His reservoirs were low, ours were filling full. The balance of numbers had turned heavily. The British had actually killed and wounded or captured nearly 400,000 Germans in the 5 weeks' grapple, while all their own losses in men and material had by the activities of their government been more than replaced. Indeed, our army at the end of June was somewhat stronger than on the eve of the 21st of March. Divisions had been drawn from Italy, from Salonika and from Egypt. Masses of troops had been released from home by the War Office rising superior at long last to the absurd fear of invasion. Sedentary divisions of older men had been formed to hold the trench lines. When the time came, they proved they could march as well as stand. Sir Douglas Haig was conscious of a continued accretion of strength, and as the event was to prove, he was able to measure it better than anyone else. The resources of France, so prodigally spent at the beginning, so jealously husbanded in the later years, were sufficient for a final effort. And behind them the Americans gathered in tens of thousands day by day. By this date the British Marine alone, military and merchant, had carried and convoyed to France, with scarcely any loss of life from enemy action, nearly 750,000 American troops. All these facts justified confidence in the successful termination of the year's campaign, and that the next year would be decisive. The personal position of Marshal Foch after the 27th of May was not, however, entirely unshaken. On him France fixed the prime responsibility of having diverted the French reserves to cover the juncture of the British and French armies. The appointment of a generalissimo had only been carried in the face of serious and natural oppositions. The first fruits of unity of command and of Foch's personal direction of the front had been a blazing disaster. Strong undercurrents ran of complaint and reproach. The British did not think they had been well treated in their intense trial. Moreover, there were reasonable grounds for misgiving. Unlike Haig or Pétain, Marshal Foch had not at his disposal the great machinery of a general staff. He acted only through what he has pleasingly described as ma famille militaire, a small band of devoted officers who had throughout the war shared his varied fortunes. At their head stood a certain young General Weygand, alert, discreet, and silent in manner, afterwards to become better known. Whether this extremely restricted circle would be able to inform their chief upon the vast and innumerable masses of technical detail which must be mastered before the operations of great modern armies can be weighed and selected from among alternatives, was a question at that time without an answer. On this account also many doubts were entertained. Nevertheless, Marshal Foch, building his house on the rock of strategic truth, possessed his soul in patience. During this period of hard tension, the Imperial War Cabinet, comprising of prime ministers of the Dominions, was frequently in session in London. Sir Henry Wilson, one day in presenting to them an appreciation of the whole position, went back to the beginning and took occasion to refer to my work with him in the years before the war. This led me to prepare for the Dominion ministers a short general survey of past, present, and future as I saw them then. I print it as I wrote it. It is a record of that darkest hour which, we are told, precedes the dawn. A note on the war. To the Imperial War Cabinet. June 22, 1918. First. Before the war, the British military authorities forecasted with accuracy what the German plan of campaign would be, and Sir Henry Wilson in particular, as early as August 1911, unfolded to the Committee of Imperial Defense a completely true picture of the German attack in the West, through Belgium towards Paris, and also of the Russian weakness and tardy mobilization in the East. On the other hand, our military advisers took a far too sanguine view of the relative strength and efficiency of the French and German armies. On the outbreak of war, the overpowering need was to stem the German rush, first on Paris and secondly on the Channel ports, and no one could think of anything else on land till this was done. By the end of November, as the Chief of the Staff has explained, Paris and the Channel ports were saved, and the German onslaught brought to a standstill. The first phase of the war, which may be called stemming the rush, thus came to an end. Second. The second phase covered a period of 18 to 20 months, that is, from the end of 1914 to the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. During the whole of this period, the position in the West was that the Anglo-French armies were strong enough to hold the Germans, but not strong enough to attack them with any chance of piercing their fortified lines. The main theater, that is, the theater where the main forces are gathered, ceased to be, for the time being, the decisive theater, that is, the theater where an important decision can be obtained. These conditions were clearly recognized in the British cabinet. They were disputed by both the British and French military authorities. The divergence of view arising from different estimates of forces and values led to the loss of opportunities which will never recur. Third, the politicians were in the main generally convinced that the deadlock in the West would continue until a great British army could be called into being, and equipped with a powerful artillery and plentiful munitions. They therefore immediately looked for other theaters in which our forces could gain decisive results in the interval. Two great operations, each involving the concerted action of our naval, military, and diplomatic resources, presented themselves. First, the rallying of the group of small states at the northwestern corner of Europe, thus turning the enemy's right flank, obtaining command of the Baltic, and forming contact with Russia in the north, or, secondly, rallying the group of small states at the southeastern corner of Europe, striking down Turkey before Germany could organize her, and establishing contact with Russia from the south. Of these two policies, the first was clearly the more difficult, and was never perhaps possible, having regard to our resources. The second, however, was not only possible but easy of accomplishment if the proper measures had been taken. Turkey was isolated from Germany by the Balkan states. She was ill-organized and ill-prepared. She was menaced by Russia. We held better cards than the Germans in regard to every single one of the Balkan states. The partition of the Turkish Empire offered the means of satisfying every appetite. Lastly, the naval situation was entirely favorable. Our margins in the North Sea had been greatly increased since the declaration of war. The German submarines had not become formidable, and the destruction of von Spee had completed the clearance of the German warships from the surface of the oceans. An amphibious operation to strike down Turkey before she could raise her head, and to unite the Balkan states against their natural foes, the Turkish and Austrian empires, was well within the scope of the naval and military resources at our disposal, after providing an ample superiority over the Germans in the North Sea and sufficient forces to defend actively the front in France and Flanders. It was therefore towards the southern flank of the enemy's line, to Turkey and to the Balkans, that our operations were directed, but alas, half-heartedly. Fourth, the natural tendency of the naval and military point of view is to confuse the main and the decisive theaters. Wherever the main part of the army or the main part of the fleet is assembled, always claims their partisanship. Footnote: I have not corrected this wartime grammar, as the sense is clear. End of footnote. Accordingly, the professional opinion of the Navy grudged and resisted the employment at the Dardanelles of every unit, even the most worthless, and the professional opinion of the Army delayed, grudged, and stinted the employment of every soldier and of every shell required for the Eastern campaign. These tendencies, which would have been overborne by success, became at the first check overpowering. The Eastern enterprise was therefore cast away, with consequences of measureless disaster. Bulgaria, always the key of the Balkans, remained undecided while the fate of the Dardanelles hung in the balance. Her course was determined by the loss of the Battle of Suvla Bay. The destruction of Serbia followed immediately, and the destruction of Romania a year later. Turkey was gripped and organized by the Germans, entailing great diversions of our forces to Egypt and Mesopotamia. Adding the loss involved by these diversions to the loss arising from the destruction of Serbia and Romania, the paralysis of Greece, and the hostility of Bulgaria, our failure to prosecute the Eastern enterprise successfully may well have equaled the addition of 2 million soldiers to the ranks of our enemies. Besides this, we lost the means to succor and animate Russia by direct contact. Fifth, the third phase of the war supervenes upon the second. After the year 1915, there were no hopes of gaining any good results in Turkey or the Balkans. The Germans were everywhere in complete communication and control. In consequence, Allied armies large enough to achieve success in those theaters were too large for the carrying capacity of our seaborne tonnage. Moreover, the submarine had become formidable in the Mediterranean, and the military weakness of Russia was plainly apparent. Half the soldiers lost and half the shells fired in Artois in May, and at Loos and in Chemin in September 1915, resolutely used, would have achieved for us the whole southeastern theatre of war in that year. But in 1916 4 times their number could not have retrieved the position. The extinction of other possibilities left France, therefore, the only theatre open to us. Footnote: I did not think it useful to discuss in this paper a surprise attack in 1916 by all the forces in the Mediterranean theatre upon the Gallipoli Peninsula. No one would have weighed it seriously at this time. End of footnote. Meanwhile, however, a great British army had come into being, abundantly supplied with munitions. The third, or as it may be called, the slogging phase, then began. This lasted from the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st July 1916, to the end of the Passchendaele attacks in November 1917. During the whole of this period, the British armies, sometimes alone and sometimes assisted by the French, were hurled almost continuously, or with the briefest intervals for recovery, in assaults upon the fortified German lines. I have personally always held the view that at no time in this period were we strong enough, in the absence of some entirely novel method of attack applied on a gigantic scale, that is, tanks or gas, to break through the skillful German defense, reinforced as it always was and still is, by the power of giving ground wherever necessary without serious consequence. Still, such was the heroic gallantry of the armies and the determination of their leaders, so powerful was the artillery of which they disposed, that the hope of victory and the sense of mastery were never quenched in the hearts of our troops until the mud deluge of Passchendaele. The most hopeful climax of these operations was, however, probably reached at the end of the year 1916, in the later phases of the Battle of the Somme. At this time the enemy were at their greatest strain. They were weakened by their folly at Verdun. They were attacked simultaneously by the British and French armies astride of the Somme. Brusilov gained his great victories on the Austrian front, and Romania plunged into the war. The exertions which the Germans made in this emergency should make us realize the strength of our foe. By dint of them they managed to reach the winter, striking down Romania meanwhile. Sixth, the Germans did not feel themselves strong enough in the spring of 1917 to withstand the renewed onslaught of the British and French armies. They therefore ruptured the Anglo-French plans for combined action by suddenly withdrawing their line from the Somme battlefields almost to Saint-Quentin and Cambrai. They thus placed a broad belt of devastated country between them and their would-be assailants, and also between the British and French armies. By this maneuver they avoided the kind of long-prepared accumulated blow they have struck at us this year, and only had to face through the rest of 1917 disconnected attacks by the British, and occasionally by the French. The campaign of 1917 therefore became very disastrous to us. Although each military episode taken by itself, wore the aspect of a fine success, with captures of ground and guns and prisoners, in reality we were consuming our strength without any adequate result. 7th. Late in the year, a false naval argument played its part in swaying military policy. The harbors of Zeebrugge and Ostend were represented as being the source of the submarine warfare, and their capture or suppression was alleged to be vital. As a matter of fact, these harbors, of course, have never been and could never be the main base of submarine warfare. That has only been directed and can only be directed from the permanent naval bases of Germany in the estuaries of the Elbe, the Weser and the Ems. Ostend and Zeebrugge were serious annoyances, but as objectives they were utterly inadequate to the sacrifices demanded of the army in order to secure the Flanders coast. Moreover, the season of the year was advanced. The Russian collapse had taken place. Nobody else was fighting. The numbers of the enemy on the front attacked were almost equal to our own. The direction of the attack was perceived and thoroughly prepared against by elaborate semi-permanent fortifications. In these circumstances, the amazing efforts of the British armies could have no other result than to weaken themselves. The incidental disaster which happened to Italy was not so harmful as it looked. Here renewed effort more than made up for the heavy losses sustained. 8th. While our commanders were intent upon the battle and in hopes of gaining successes in the nick of time, they do not seem to have realized the awful consequences of the collapse of Russia. But in November and December this apprehension grew with politicians and generals, both British and French. The flow of German divisions and batteries from Russia to the west was unceasing for many months, until finally a power had been accumulated which, after marking down every division of which we could dispose, left the enemy with a punching force of nearly 50 divisions. The enemy's military methods differ from our own. In attack, the German uses surprise. In defense, he uses concrete. Our defensive problem this year is far more difficult than that which the Germans solved successfully in 1917. On every occasion in 1917, except at Cambrai, the Germans knew where the attack would fall. Every attack, except Cambrai, was indicated by several days' bombardment, apart from every evidence of ill-camouflaged preparation. Every German position was defended by lines of solid shell-proof structures, sheltering machine guns, and ample reserves were held in rear to arrest a successful advance, beyond the limits of our offensive barrage. Lastly, the Germans could always afford to give up some of the territory they overran so easily at the beginning of the war. Our position this year has been very different. The initiative has passed completely to the enemy. His attack is mounted actually or in dummy over practically the whole battlefront. And besides, we can never exclude his eruption at some quite unexpected point. We, on the other hand, have at least 4 places, Calais, Amiens, Paris, Verdun, which we regard as capital. The enemy can therefore ring the changes on a succession of vital points, before each one of which we have little or no ground to spare. Meanwhile, the use of gas and smoke has given new facilities to the offensive, and our methods of fortifications are still primitive compared to those of the Germans. In this dire situation, nothing has saved us except the stamina of our armies and the physical difficulties of persevering in an offensive after a certain distance. The stubborn resistance which the enemy has encountered, the bloody repulses which, in spite of his successes, he has sustained on the greatest scale, and the resources in men and material which the threat of utter ruin has extorted from the Allies, have gone far to equalize the struggle. It is even probable that we shall end this campaign of agony and disaster in far better posture than we began it. But what are we going to do then? Ninth. This is the question to which I have been leading up. If I have tried to pick out, as I see them, the salient points in the past, it is with the object of showing that there are now and in the immediate future just as vital decisions to be taken if we can only secure the necessary vision and command. It may be that the Imperial War Cabinet will be able to impart to the Allied conduct of the war that general design and true selection of vital objectives which we have never yet been able to obtain. 10th. There are two perfectly simple things to do. They have long been staring us in the face. Everybody sees them, but they see so much else at the same time that nothing effective has yet been done. 1. Above all things, reconstitute the fighting front in the East. 2. Make a plan for an offensive battle in France in 1919, choosing the period of climax and subordinating, as far as pressure of circumstances will allow, every intervening event to that supreme purpose. If we cannot reconstitute the fighting front against Germany in the East, no end can be discerned to the war. Vain will be all the sacrifices of the peoples and the armies. They will only tend to prolong the conflict into depths which cannot be plumbed. We must not take no for an answer either from America or from Japan. We must compel events instead of acquiescing in their drift. Surely now, when Czech divisions are in possession of large sections of the Siberian Railway and in danger of being done to death by the treacherous Bolsheviks, some effort to rescue them can be made. Footnote. Some of the Bohemian prisoners taken by Brusilov in 1916 had been formed into a Czech army corps which fought with resolution against the Austrian Empire. The Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik desertion of the Allied corps left these soldiers in a forlorn position, from which their discipline and firm political convictions ultimately extricated them. End of footnote. Every man should ask himself each day whether he is not too readily accepting negative resolutions. May we not assume that President Wilson will regard the rescue of the Czechs as an obligation of honor? Who can rescue them except the Japanese? 11th. Secondly, we must organize the offensive battle for 1919. It will be no use of thinking about this in the winter, when we may hope our present anxieties will be at an end. It will be too late then. Unless while we are fighting for our lives, or this summer, we can look ahead and plan for 1919. We shall be in the same melancholy position next year as we are this. In this war, the initiative can only be seized as the result of plans made nearly a year ahead and through the successful overcoming of some great difficulty. It is not possible at the present time to conceive and visualize a victorious offensive battle in the summer of 1919, to manufacture all the apparatus necessary to that battle, and to subordinate intervening arrangements, as far as daily needs will let us, to bringing about a situation favorable to that battle. Do the means of beating the German armies in the West in 1919 exist? Can the men be procured? If so, the mechanisms can be prepared. We still have the time. Have we the willpower and the command?